The alarm screamed through Outpost Meridian, just as the third moon rose over the frozen wasteland of Kelvara 9, and Commander Jake Harrison jumped from his bed before his mind fully understood the danger. He grabbed his jacket and ran through the metal corridors with his boots making loud sounds against the floor, and the outpost was home to 15 soldiers and scientists who studied the ancient ruins on this cold moon, and for 6 months they had seen nothing but ice storms and wild animals, until tonight. The command center was full of people moving quickly, and screens showed heat patterns and movement sensors, and Jake pushed past Corporal Danny Wright to reach the main window, and what he saw made him stop breathing. She stood just beyond the barrier, and the lights from the outpost made her easy to see even through the falling snow. And she was tall and thin, with skin that seemed to change between silver and pale blue. And her ears were long and pointed and swept back in a graceful way, and her eyes glowed like melted gold in the darkness, and she wore armor that looked like it had grown. Instead of being made with curves and crystal edges, behind her was the dragon, and it was coiled like a living mountain. The creature had scales that reflected light in rainbow colors and even curled up. It was bigger than their largest transport vehicle, and its eyes were smart and old, and they looked at the outpost with focus that made Jake nervous, and steam came from its nose. In steady clouds, the woman raised one hand with her palm facing forward, and Jake hoped it meant peace, and her lips moved, but the wind was too loud to hear anything. Jake gave orders to open a communication channel, and they would see if she spoke. Their language, Lieutenant Amy Foster worked the controls quickly, and the woman touched something at her throat, and then her voice filled the command center, and it was musical and strange, but they could understand her words. She said her name was Lyra Silverwind, and she needed sanctuary, and she came with a warning, and she wanted to make an alliance, and the darkness that destroyed her world was now looking at their world. Jake looked at his team, and the rules said to refuse entry to unknown creatures, and the rules said to report to high command and wait for orders, but something in the woman's eyes showed desperate need. Lyra continued talking as if she knew he was thinking hard about what to do, and she spoke about the Void Collective, and she said humans had met their scouts and 3 colony ships were lost in the past year, and humans thought it was system failures, but it was not. Jake felt cold fear run through him because those losses were secret information, and how could she know about them? Lyra said her people had fought the Void Collective for 300 years, and they lost, and their homeworld burned, and her kind were scattered among the stars as refugees and wanderers. But she had studied the enemy, and she knew their weak points, and she knew how they could be stopped. Jake asked why she wanted to help humanity, and his tactical mind was already thinking about threats, and an enemy ship could be hidden nearby, and this could be a trap. Lyra's golden eyes met his through the window, and for a moment the distance between them seemed to disappear, and Jake felt real emotion in her look, and there was loss and determination and something he could not name. She said quietly that she had nowhere else to go, and the Void Collective would not stop with her people, and because in all her travels she had found humanity to be fierce and able to adapt and impossibly stubborn, and if any species could stand against the tide, it was humans. And she asked to stay, and she asked to teach them what she knew, and she would offer what no human woman ever could, and that was the secrets of a civilization that nearly defeated the darkness. The command center became silent except for the hum of machines and the sound of wind outside. Amy asked what Jake wanted to do. Jake studied the alien woman and her dragon, and every instinct told him this was dangerous, but another part of him that had kept him alive through many battles whispered that this was an opportunity. He ordered them to lower the barrier, but to go to battle stations with full alert, and he wanted weapons ready, and if this went wrong, he wanted overwhelming response, ready to fire. The energy barrier disappeared, and Lyra Silverwind took her first step onto human ground with her dragon following, and its footsteps shook the earth, and neither Jake Harrison nor anyone on Outpost Meridian knew it yet. But this moment would be remembered as the beginning of the greatest alliance and the most devastating war that humanity had ever known. The dragon that Lyra called Starfire settled in the cargo bay, with surprising grace for something as big as a small spaceship, and the creature made them reorganize everything, and equipment was moved, and scientists were relocated, and there was an uncomfortable debate about safety rules, and through it all Lyra remained patient, and answered questions with careful diplomacy. Jake watched from the observation deck as Dr. Helen Carter started doing scans, and the scientist's hands shook slightly as she worked from excitement or fear or both. Helen reported that Lyra's body was remarkable and her cells were partly crystal, which might explain why she glowed, and her brain patterns suggested a life measured in centuries, not decades, and the bond between her and the dragon was not just friendship, but symbiotic, and their brain patterns synchronized and they were sharing thoughts. Jake said that was not possible, but Helen reminded him that dragons were not possible either. Yet here they were, and that was a fair point. 3 days passed quickly with meetings and strategy sessions, and Lyra proved her value right away. And she gave tactical data on Void Collective ship designs, and weapon systems and invasion patterns, and she described horrors the research team had only theorized about, and there were planet-eating swarms and technology that drained consciousness, and entire star systems reduced to empty husks. But she also brought hope, and she showed weak points in their armor and frequencies that disrupted their communications and battle formations, that had in rare cases driven them back. Jake found himself spending more time with her than was strictly necessary, and he told himself it was to verify her information and build trust. But truthfully, he was fascinated one evening in the mess hall. He watched her examine human coffee with the curiosity of someone studying a strange artifact, and he asked what her people were like. Lyra's face softened, and she said they were proud and ancient, and they believed themselves invincible for too long. And their technology was poetry made real, with living cities that grew from crystals and ships that sailed. Solar winds like ancient sailors sailed oceans, and they had art that could reshape emotions, and music that could heal wounds of body and spirit. Jake said it sounded beautiful. Lyra agreed it was. And then she took a small sip of coffee and made a face and said the drink was deeply unpleasant. Jake laughed despite himself and said, "Most humans thought so too, but they drank it anyway." Lyra said humans were a curious species, but her eyes sparkled with amusement. The moment ended when Amy burst into the mess hall with a tablet in her hand, and she said they had a problem, and High Command finally responded to their reports about Lyra. Jake's stomach felt heavy, and he asked what they said. Amy told him they were sending Admiral Patricia Hayes with a full battle group, and they would arrive in 6 hours, and orders were to secure the alien and her dragon for military intelligence purposes. And Amy's face was carefully neutral when she said they were classifying Lyra as a strategic asset. Lyra stood up quickly, and understanding flashed across her face, and she said asset meant prisoner. Jake said no quickly, and that was not what it meant. But Lyra interrupted him and said it was precisely what that meant, and she had seen this pattern before, and his superiors would take apart her knowledge and study Starfire like a curiosity, and when they had taken all value they would discard them. Or worse, they would turn them into weapons. Jake insisted that would not happen, though doubt ate at him. And would High Command really be so short-sighted, and after everything he learned about Lyra's people and their tragedy, and her genuine desire to help? Yes, a cynical part of him answered, and if they thought it gave humanity an edge, Command would do anything. Lyra walked to the window overlooking the frozen landscape, and she said there was something she had not told him. And the Void Collective did not simply destroy things, but they corrupted, and they turned allies against each other, and exploited fear and greed, and sowed discord until civilizations collapsed from within. And she looked back at him and asked what Admiral Hayes would see when she arrived, and would she see an ally offering salvation, or a threat to be contained before? Jake could answer. The alarm sounded again. This time it was not a visitor, and the sensor arrays lit up with dozens of contacts emerging from the dark side of Kelvara 9. And there were ships, and they were sleek, organic-looking vessels that moved with unnatural precision. Amy said it was the Void Collective, and her face was pale, and there were 17 vessels from frigate to cruiser class, and they were forming an assault pattern. Lyra transformed immediately, and the diplomatic visitor vanished, and was replaced by a warrior who had fought these enemies longer than most humans lived. And she said they followed her, and she led them here. And guilt flashed across her face, and she was sorry. Jake asked if they could hold them, and his mind raced through defensive options, and Outpost Meridian had shields and defense systems, but against 17 warships, how long could they last? Lyra said not for long, but she could buy them time and Starfire, and she would. Starfire settled in the cargo bay with surprising grace for something as massive as a small building, and the dragon's presence forced everyone to reorganize quickly, and equipment was moved to different areas, and scientists relocated their stations, and there was an uncomfortable debate about safety procedures, and through everything Lyra remained calm and patient, and answered their questions with careful words. Jake watched from the observation deck as Dr. Helen Carter conducted her first scans, and the scientist's hands trembled slightly as she worked, and it could have been from excitement or fear, or both. Helen reported over their private channel that Lyra's body structure was remarkable, and her cells were partially crystalline, which might explain the glow, and her brain activity suggested a lifespan measured in centuries instead of decades. And the bond between her and the dragon was more than just companionship, and it was symbiotic, and their neural patterns synchronized, and they were literally sharing thoughts. Jake muttered that such a thing was not possible. Helen reminded him that neither were dragons yet. Here they were, and that was a fair point. 3 days passed in a blur of meetings and strategy sessions, and Lyra proved her value immediately, and she provided tactical data on Void Collective ship configurations and weapon systems and invasion patterns, and she described horrors the research team had only theorized about, and there were planet-consuming swarms and consciousness-draining technology and entire star systems reduced to lifeless shells. But she also brought hope, and she revealed weak points in their defenses and frequencies that disrupted their hive communications and battle formations, that had in rare instances driven them back. Jake found himself spending more time with her than strictly necessary, and he told himself it was due diligence and verifying her intelligence and building trust. But truthfully, he was fascinated by her one evening in the mess hall. He asked about her people and what they were like, and he watched her examine human coffee with the curiosity of someone studying an alien artifact. Lyra's expression softened, and she said her people were proud and ancient, and they believed themselves invincible for too long, and their technology was poetry made real. And there were living cities that grew from seed crystals and ships that sailed solar winds like ancient sailors sailed Earth's oceans, and they had art that could reshape emotions and music that could heal wounds of both body and spirit. Jake said it sounded beautiful. Lyra agreed that it was. And then she took a cautious sip of coffee and grimaced and declared, "The beverage, deeply unpleasant." Jake laughed despite himself and admitted that most humans thought so too. But they drank it anyway. Lyra murmured that humans were a curious species, but her eyes sparkled with something like amusement. The moment shattered when Amy burst into the mess hall with her tablet clutched tight, and she announced they had a problem and High Command had finally responded to their reports about Lyra. Jake's stomach dropped, and he asked what they said. Amy explained they were sending Admiral Patricia Hayes with a full battle group, and estimated arrival was 6 hours, and orders were to secure the alien and her dragon for military intelligence purposes. And Amy's face stayed carefully neutral as she added, they were classifying Lyra as a strategic asset. Lyra stood quickly, and understanding flashed across her features, and she said that asset meant prisoner. Jake protested quickly and said no, that was not the case. But Lyra interrupted and said it was precisely what that meant, and she had seen this pattern before, and his superiors would dissect her knowledge and study Starfire like a laboratory specimen. And when they had extracted all value, they would discard them. Or worse, they would weaponize them. Jake insisted that would not happen, though uncertainty gnawed at him, and would High Command really show such short-sighted thinking? And after everything he had learned about Lyra's tragedy and her genuine desire to help, a cynical voice in his mind answered yes. And if they thought it gave humanity an advantage, Command would do anything. Lyra walked to the viewport overlooking the frozen wasteland, and she said there was something she had not told him, and the Void Collective did not simply destroy, but they corrupted, and they turned allies against each other and exploited fear and greed and sowed discord until civilizations collapsed from within. And she glanced back at him and asked what Admiral Hayes would see when she arrived, and would it be an ally offering salvation, or a threat to be contained? Before Jake could respond, the alarm shrieked again. This time it was not a visitor, and the sensor arrays exploded with contacts, and dozens of signatures emerged from the dark side of Kelvara 9, and the ships were sleek and organic-looking, and they moved with disturbing precision. Amy announced it was the Void Collective, and her face went pale, and she counted 17 vessels ranging from frigate to cruiser class, and they were forming an assault pattern. Lyra's transformation was immediate, and the diplomatic visitor vanished and was replaced by a warrior who had fought these enemies longer than most humans lived, and she said they had followed her, and she had led them here. And guilt crossed her face. As she apologized, Jake demanded to know if they could hold them, and his mind raced through defensive options, and Outpost Meridian had shields and point defense systems. But against 17 warships, the odds were grim. Lyra said, not for long, but she could buy them time and starfire, and she would engage, and they had done this many times before. Jake protested that was suicide, and one dragon against 17 ships could not possibly work. Lyra paused at the doorway, and the golden glow of her eyes intensified, and for a moment Jake saw the weight of centuries in that gaze, and she said he had asked what her people were like, and now she would show him, and they may have fallen, but they did not fall quietly. She disappeared down the corridor, moving with inhuman speed. Jake spun to his team and ordered all hands to battle stations, and he wanted every weapon system online, and he told someone to establish a communication line to the incoming battle group and inform them assistance was needed immediately. But even as orders flew and his crew scrambled to defensive positions, Jake knew the truth, and Admiral Hayes was 6 hours away, and the Void Collective fleet would arrive in 20 minutes, unless a mysterious elf woman and her dragon could somehow hold back the tide of darkness that had consumed an entire civilization. Through the viewport, starfire exploded from the cargo bay, and his wings spread wide enough to eclipse both moons, and Lyra sat astride the dragon's shoulders, and her armor glowed with internal light. And as they climbed toward the stars, Jake heard her voice one final time over the open communication channel. She said, "This was for Silverhaven, and for the lost, and for those who still fought." Then, Dragon and Rider dove into the void, racing toward an impossible battlespace combat, as Jake had learned during his years in the Defense Force was typically conducted at vast distances, and ships exchanged fire from thousands of kilometers away, and they relied on advanced targeting computers and missile guidance systems, and it was clean and calculated and almost sterile. What Lyra and Starfire did was nothing like that. The dragon moved through the void like a creature born to it, and he banked and spiraled with impossible grace, and his scales seemed to absorb starlight and then refracted in blinding pulses that scrambled the Void Collective's targeting systems, and from the command center Jake watched in awe as the tactical display lit up with energy signatures. Helen reported from her science station, and her voice carried disbelief as she said, Lyra was generating localized gravity wells, and the dragon's biology was manipulating space-time itself, and that was how they were maneuvering without conventional thrust on the main screen. Starfire opened his massive jaws, and what emerged was not fire, but something far stranger, and it was a beam of concentrated plasma that seemed to phase between dimensions, and it bypassed shields entirely, and the nearest Void Collective frigate simply disintegrated, and its hull dissolved into molecular fragments. Danny called out that it was a direct hit, and the enemy frigate was destroyed. But 16 ships remained, and they were adapting quickly, and the Void Collective vessels moved in coordinated patterns, and their tactics spoke of a single unified intelligence, and they created crossfire zones and overlapping fields, and they were herding Starfire into a kill box. Lyra saw the trap developing, and through the external cameras Jake watched her lean forward, and the dragon suddenly folded his wings and dropped through a gap in the formation, and as they passed beneath a cruiser's underbelly, Lyra extended her hand, and crystalline energy erupted from her palm, and it lanced through the warship's main reactor. The explosion lit up the void like a newborn star. Emmy murmured that 2 ships were down and 15 remained. But the toll was beginning to show, and Starfire's movements grew less fluid, and scorch marks marred his iridescent scales where enemy fire had found its mark. And Lyra was slumped slightly in the saddle, and the glow of her armor flickered weakly. Jake said quietly that they could not keep this up, and he turned to his weapons officer and ordered all missile batteries ready, and he wanted firing solutions on the nearest 3 targets. The officer warned that at this range they would burn through their entire arsenal. In minutes, Jake said. Then they had better make every shot count, and he told them to prepare to fire on his command. The battle became a desperate dance, and Outpost Meridian's missiles streaked toward the void. Admiral Patricia Hayes was exactly as Jake imagined, and she was stern and calculating and utterly focused on results. And she arrived with 3 cruisers and a diplomatic contingent that seemed far more interested in containing Lyra than collaborating. With her and the Admiral's first act upon boarding Outpost Meridian was to declare martial law and sequester Lyra in the medical wing, under armed guard. Helen protested when Marines took up positions outside the infirmary, and she said Lyra was critically injured, and the stress alone could kill her. Admiral Hayes replied coolly that the alien represented an unprecedented security risk, and until they understood her capabilities and intentions, she would be kept under controlled conditions. And her gaze shifted to Jake, and she said she was told he granted Lyra access to classified defense data, and he would provide a full accounting of everything she had seen. Jake's jaw tightened, and he said with respect that Lyra Silverwind saved this outpost and everyone on it, and she destroyed a Void Collective harvester ship and scattered their fleet, and she deserved better treatment. Hayes interrupted and said Lyra deserved what she determined she deserved, and she informed Jake he was relieved of command pending investigation into his protocol violations, and Lieutenant Foster would assume operational control. The next 48 hours were a bureaucratic nightmare, and Jake spent most of it in debriefings defending every decision he made, and meanwhile specialists from Hayes' battle group descended on Starfire, and they scanned and cataloged the dragon with clinical detachment, and they tried to collect tissue samples until the dragon's warning growl and subsequent burst of heat that melted their equipment made them reconsider their approach. Lyra remained in medical isolation, and she was recovering slowly, but Jake was not permitted to see her. It was Helen who finally broke the stalemate, and the xenobiologist stormed into Admiral Hayes' temporary office without knocking, and her tablet was thrust forward like a weapon. Helen announced she was done being polite, and the Admiral needed to see something immediately. Hayes looked up from her paperwork, and irritation flashed across her features, and she started to say she did not have time, but Helen cut her off. Helen said bluntly that Lyra was dying. That statement got everyone's attention, and Jake, who had been waiting in the corridor hoping for a chance to speak with the Admiral, stepped into the office without permission. Helen pulled up a holographic display and explained that Lyra's cellular structure was breaking down, and the energy expenditure from destroying the harvester ship, combined with her injuries, had triggered a cascade failure, and her body was essentially consuming itself. Trying to regenerate, Jake demanded to know what she needed. Helen admitted she did not know, because Lyra's biology was unlike anything they had encountered, and the bond with Starfire suggested they shared more than just thoughts and possibly life force itself, and they were meant to support each other, and keeping them separated might be killing her. Admiral Hayes studied the data in silence, and when she finally spoke, her voice was softer than before, and she asked how long Lyra had. Helen said hours and maybe a day at most. The Admiral's expression was unreadable, and she asked if they allowed contact with the dragon. Could Lyra recover? Helen said she thought so, because the scans showed that when they were in proximity, both their cellular structures stabilized, and it was like they were 2 halves of a symbiotic whole. Hayes sat back in her chair, and for a long moment the only sound was the hum of electronics, and then she tapped her communication device and ordered the security detail to allow the dragon into the medical wing, and she told them to take necessary precautions, but do not interfere with treatment. Jake released a breath. He did not know he had been holding. 30 minutes later, he stood outside the infirmary observation window, watching as Starfire carefully maneuvered his bulk through the reinforced doors, and the dragon moved with obvious pain, because his damaged wing had been stabilized, but the wounds from battle were still healing. Inside the room, Lyra lay on a medical bed, and her silver skin was almost transparent, and monitors showed vital signs that meant nothing to human medicine, but seemed universally concerning, and her eyes were closed and her breathing was shallow. Starfire approached slowly, and he extended his massive head toward his companion, and the moment their physical connection was made, when the dragon's snout touched Lyra's outstretched hand, the change was immediate and dramatic. Color began returning to her skin, and the ragged rhythm of her breathing steadied, and most remarkably, a soft glow emanated from both beings, and it pulsed in synchronization, like a shared heartbeat. Helen breathed the word remarkable beside Jake, and she explained the energy transfer was actually visible on multiple spectrums, and they were healing each other in real time. Over the next few hours, Lyra's condition improved dramatically, and by evening she was sitting up and speaking quietly with Helen about her physiology, and Starfire remained close and he was curled protectively around the medical bed like a guardian admiral. Hayes watched from the observation deck and her expression was thoughtful. And when Lyra was finally strong enough for visitors, the admiral entered alone, and she waved off her security detail with a gesture. Jake could not hear the conversation, but he watched intently, and Hayes and Lyra spoke for nearly an hour, and the admiral's body language shifted from confrontational to contemplative to what might have been respectful. And when Hayes finally emerged, she beckoned to Jake. The admiral said they should walk together. They made their way to the observation lounge overlooking Kelvara 9's frozen plains, and the aurora was particularly brilliant that night, and it cast ribbons of color across the ice. Hayes said abruptly that she owed Jake an apology, and she explained she arrived with preconceptions, and after reading his report she saw a security breach and a potential enemy asset, and she did not see someone who had lost everything and was still trying to fight. Jake said simply that Lyra was genuine, and everything she told them checked out. Hayes agreed and said she had her intelligence team verifying Lyra's tactical data against their own observations of Void collective movements, and it was accurate to a disturbing degree, and she paused before continuing. The admiral said Lyra told her something important during their conversation, and Lyra said that her people's greatest failing was not military, but their inability to trust other species enough to build alliances, and by the time they reached out for help, they had been fighting alone for so long that no one believed they could win. Jake said quietly that Lyra did not want humanity to make the same mistake. Hayes agreed and said neither did she, and her jaw set with determination, and she announced she was recommending to High Command that they establish formal diplomatic relations with any surviving members of Lyra's people. And she was also recommending the creation of a joint task force with humans and elves, specifically designed to counter the Void collective threat. Jake felt hope kindle in his chest, and he asked if she thought Command would approve. Hayes said after she showed them the battle footage, and after they saw what one dragon and rider did against 17 warships, they would be fools not to approve, and whatever else High Command might be, they were not fools. Jake asked what would happen to Lyra and Starfire. Hayes said that was up to them, but she hoped they would choose to stay and to teach humanity, because they had a lot to learn, and not much time to learn. A chime interrupted them, and Amy's voice came through the communication system saying that both Commander Harrison and Admiral Hayes needed to see something immediately. They rushed to the command center where the main screen showed a tactical display of the outer system, and new contacts were appearing, and there were dozens of them emerging from jump points throughout the sector. Jake asked if they were Void collective ships, and his heart sank. Amy replied no, and explained they were broadcasting on Lyra's people's frequencies, and the ships matched the configurations she had described, and there were at least 40 vessels. The communication system crackled, and a new voice filled the command center, and it was female and spoke with the same melodic accent as Lyra. The voice said this was the Wayfarer's fleet, and they sought Lyra Silverwind, and they felt the light of her soul fire across the stars. And if she lived, and if she had found sanctuary, they would join her, and they would stand with those who stood with her. Admiral Hayes and Jake exchanged glances, and then the Admiral stepped forward and identified herself as Admiral Patricia Hayes of the Human Defense Force, and she said, Lyra Silverwind lived, and she was safe and recovering from battle wounds sustained defending this installation. There was a long pause, and then the voice asked if humans fought beside her. Hayes confirmed they did. Another pause followed, and this one was longer, and when the voice returned it carried deep emotion. And the speaker said then perhaps there was hope after all, and they requested permission to approach. And they had information about Void collective movements in 3 adjacent sectors, and they had weapons and warriors, and they had nowhere else to go. Admiral Hayes looked at Jake and then at the tactical display showing 40 ships full of refugees and fighters, and she took a breath. She said permission was granted, and she welcomed them to Outpost Meridian and said they had much to discuss in the medical wing. Lyra lifted her head and her golden eyes brightened, and through their bond, 20 hours later, Jake found himself in the briefing room facing the assembled captains of humanity's hastiest task force, and beside him Lyra stood before a holographic display showing the Tarsus system, and Admiral Hayes observed from the back, and her presence was a silent statement of authority. Lyra began by pointing to the system's outer reaches, and she explained the Void Collective would arrive here, and they would deploy harvester vessels to the inhabited worlds while their warships established a perimeter, and she said, standard doctrine was to engage the warships first and draw them away from civilian populations. Murmurs of agreement came from the human captains. Lyra continued and said that was exactly what the enemy expected, and it was exactly wrong. The murmurs became protests, and Captain Nicole Brooks spoke up and asked if Lyra was suggesting they ignore the warships and let them maintain position, while harvesters attacked colonies. Lyra replied calmly that she was suggesting they kill the brain first, and she manipulated the display and highlighted one specific ship in the enemy formation, and it was larger than the others and positioned at the fleet's center. And she explained this was a Nexus vessel, and it coordinated all Void Collective ships in the sector through quantum entanglement, and if they destroyed it, every ship connected to that network would lose cohesion, and they would become individuals rather than a single organism. Another captain called out that it sounded great, but asked how they would reach it through 50 enemy ships. Lyra's smile was sharp, and she said they would not fight through them but go under them. She explained the plan, and Jake watched skepticism transform into disbelief and then grudging understanding, and it was audacious and dangerous, and it relied on technology that had never been tested in large scale combat. It might actually work. Lyra said the Wayfarer's fleet had taught human engineers to generate localized spatial distortions, and individually their ships could not sustain them long enough to matter. But in concert and creating overlapping fields, they could punch through real space itself, and it would be a shortcut and 10 seconds of transit through what human scientists called subspace, and they would emerge inside the enemy formation directly on top of the Nexus vessel. Captain Brooks said slowly that 10 seconds did not sound like much, but at combat speeds in a space that was only theoretically understood, it could be dangerous. Lyra acknowledged it would feel like an eternity, and they would see things that hurt to perceive, and their instruments would lie, and they must trust their navigation algorithms and each other absolutely. And her golden eyes swept across the room, and she said this was why they fought together, and her people lost because they trusted no one, and humans could win because they learned to trust. Admiral Hayes stepped forward and said she would not lie, because this was the riskiest operation any of them would ever attempt. But Commander Silverwind was right, and conventional tactics would not save Tarsus, but this might. And she paused to let that sink in, and she said she was authorizing the operation, and each captain would have the chance to volunteer their ship and crew, and no one would think less of any captain who declined. Not a single captain stood to leave. Jake felt pride swell in his chest, and this was humanity at its best. And they were staring into the abyss and choosing to jump anyway. The battle began exactly on schedule, and the Void Collective fleet emerged from jump space in perfect formation, and there were 53 vessels moving with the eerie precision of a single mind. And 3 harvester ships immediately broke away toward the inhabited planets, and their corruption tendrils were already extending. Admiral Hayes gave the order, and all ships were to execute Operation Starfall. 23 ships, both human and elven, ignited their drives and raced toward the enemy fleet. But they were not heading for the warships, and instead they formed a tight spearhead formation, and each vessel's spatial distortion generator hummed to life. Jake gripped his console as reality began to fold around his ship, the USS Defiance, and through the viewport space itself seemed to tear, and it revealed something beyond, and it was a realm of impossible colors and geometries that made his eyes water. The countdown began in subspace. Transit would begin in 3 seconds, then 2, then 1. The universe turned inside out for 10 seconds that felt like hours. Jake existed in a place where time moved sideways and light forgot how to behave, and his crew's gasps and cries echoed through. The bridge and one lieutenant became sick, and the tactical display showed nothing but static. Then, like surfacing from deep water, they burst back into real space. They were directly above the Nexus vessel. Jake roared that all ships should open fire, and they should pour everything into that target. 23 ships unleashed hell at point-blank range, and missiles and plasma cannons and railguns and elven crystal beams converged on the Nexus vessel's hull, and the massive ship's shields blazed, and held for a moment, then shattered. But the Void Collective was not defenseless, and the surrounding warships immediately pivoted and brought weapons to bear, and the Allied fleet found itself in the center of a killing zone, and enemy fire hammered them from all directions. Lyra's voice carried across all frequencies, and she called for Starfire Squadron to attack now. From the shadow of 3 human cruisers, dragons emerged, and there was not just Starfire but 6 more, and they were bonded too. Elven riders who had joined the Wayfarer's fleet, and they had been hidden by stealth fields waiting for this moment. The dragons dove into the enemy formation like living missiles, and their unique biology disrupted Void Collective targeting systems. And Starfire, who was largest and most experienced, led the assault directly toward the Nexus vessel's exposed bridge section. Lyra stood in his saddle with her arms outstretched, and Jake saw her begin to glow with the same terrible light she had wielded against the Harvester months ago, but this time she was not alone. And the other riders were channeling their own power, and there were 6 separate flames that merged into one searing lance of pure energy. The beam punched through the Nexus vessel's armor like it was paper, and for a moment nothing happened. Then every Void Collective ship in the system stopped moving. The tactical officer shouted that the coordination network was down and enemy ships were not responding to each other's movements. Admiral Hayes commanded all ships to break formation and engage at will. The battle transformed from desperate siege into brutal brawl, and without the Nexus vessels controlling intelligence, individual Void Collective ships fought according to basic programming, and they were predictable and exploitable and human, and elven forces tore into them with coordinated fury. The Harvester ships sensed their support vanishing and attempted to flee, but they did not make it far, and 3 dragons and a dozen fighters pursued them into the gravity well of Tarsus 3, and destroyed all 3 before they could harm a single civilian. When the last enemy ship either retreated or was destroyed, the Allied fleet hung in space, and they were battered, but victorious, and 7 human ships had been destroyed, and 2 elven swift ships were crippled beyond repair. And casualty counts were still coming in. But Jake knew they had paid in blood for this victory. But Tarsus was safe, and 50 million people would live to see another day in the aftermath as rescue operations began, and damage control teams worked around the clock. Jake found Lyra on the observation deck of the Defiance, and she stood alone staring at the planet below, and Starfire's massive form was curled just outside the viewport in the vacuum beyond. Jake said quietly that they did it. Lyra corrected him and said, "Humans did it, and his people trusted a mad plan from an alien refugee, and that trust saved millions." Jake said they trusted her because she earned it and because she bled for them when she did not have to. Lyra turned to face him, and in her golden eyes he saw exhaustion and relief, and something else that looked like hope. She said softly that when the Void Collective destroyed her homeworld, she thought she would wander until she died, and the best she could do was delay the inevitable and perhaps save a few lives here and there. But humans showed her that defeat did not have to be final, and new alliances could be stronger than old certainties. Jake asked if she would stay and help them build this alliance into something permanent. Lyra's smile was genuine and warm, and she said yes, she would stay, and she would offer what no human woman ever could, and that was the wisdom of a people who learned too late the price of standing alone and together. Perhaps their peoples could forge something neither could achieve separately. Jake said they would be a force that could push back the darkness. Lyra replied, "It was more than that, and it was a light bright enough that others would see it, and there would be other species and other refugees and other survivors, and what they built here was more than military alliance, and it was proof that cooperation was not weakness." Through the viewport, Starfire raised his massive head, and his eyes glinted with reflected starlight, and more dragons joined him, and it was the squadron that had turned the tide of battle, and around them human ships and elven vessels moved in harmonious patterns, and they were no longer separate fleets but a unified force. Jake said that when Lyra first appeared at their outpost, some of his crew wanted to turn her away, because they said it was too risky and too unknown. Lyra said, "And he let her in anyway." Jake agreed and said it was the best decision he ever made. 3 months after the Battle of Tarsus, the Unified Defense Coalition had grown beyond anyone's expectations, and what started as a desperate alliance between two species had become a beacon of hope across multiple star systems, and refugees from a dozen worlds arrived seeking protection, and warriors volunteered to join the cause in the darkness that once seemed unstoppable now faced organized resistance. Commander Jake Harrison stood on the bridge of the new flagship Unity and watched. The latest training exercise through the main display, and 5 human destroyers moved in perfect coordination, with 4 elven warships and 2 mixed crew vessels. And the formation was flawless, and their communications were seamless. And it was hard to believe that months ago most of these people had never even met an alien. Lyra stood beside him as she often did, and her role as first strategic advisor meant she spent half her time in strategy meetings and the other half teaching, and always she kept one eye on Starfire, who had become something of a symbol for the entire coalition. And children drew pictures of the great dragon, and pilots painted his likeness on their ships, and he wore his fame with patient dignity. She commented that Captain Brooks had improved remarkably, and her tactical thinking now incorporated both human aggression and elven patience, and it was a devastating combination. Jake agreed, and said it was because she had a good teacher. Lyra smiled, but there was something sad in her expression, and she said she had been thinking about the future and about what came next. Jake felt a flutter of concern and asked what she meant. Lyra explained that the coalition was strong now and growing stronger, and they had won 3 major engagements against the Void Collective and pushed them back from 4 colonized systems, and humanity no longer needed a wandering elf and her dragon to show them the way. Jake started to protest, but Lyra raised a hand and continued. Said her people were scattered across the galaxy, and the Wayfarers' fleet was only a small fraction of the survivors, and there were others who did not know about this alliance, and others who still fought alone and still believed they were the last of their kind, and she wanted to find them and bring them here, and show them that hope still existed. Jake understood, but it did not make the idea of her leaving any easier. And over these months, Lyra had become more than an advisor or an ally, and she had become a friend and someone he trusted absolutely, and the thought of the coalition without her felt wrong. He asked how long she would be gone. Lyra said honestly that she did not know, and space was vast, and her people had scattered far, and it could take months or years. But she would return, and she promised that, and this place had become something like home, and these people had become something like family. Before Jake could respond, alarms sounded across the bridge, and it was not the urgent battle alarm but the priority communication signal. Amy's voice came through and said they had an incoming message, and it was tagged with the highest encryption, and it came directly from Earth's High Command. Central Admiral Hayes appeared on the main screen, and her face was grave, and she said they had a situation, and it was bigger than anything they had faced before. The Void Collective had launched a coordinated assault on 5 core worlds simultaneously, and they were hitting Earth's most important colonies and military installations, and preliminary reports suggested over 200 enemy vessels, and they were using new tactics and new weapons, and early defensive efforts had failed catastrophically. Jake felt ice form in his veins and asked about casualties. Hayes said they were catastrophic, and 3 defense stations had been destroyed and civilian evacuations were underway, but millions were trapped, and Earth was mobilizing every available ship, but even with the full fleet they were outnumbered 3-1. She paused and then said the coalition was humanity's best chance, and everything they had learned and everything they had built together was about to be tested, and she was requesting immediate deployment of all coalition forces to Earth. Space Lyra stepped forward without hesitation and said the coalition would answer, and every ship and every warrior would come, and she would lead the dragon squadrons personally. Hayes nodded, and there was gratitude and determination in her expression, and she said transport coordinates were being transmitted, and time was critical, and she needed them there within 48 hours. The screen went dark, and Jake immediately began issuing orders, and all coalition ships were to prepare for immediate departure, and all personnel were to report to their stations, and all systems were to be brought to full combat readiness. The Unity transformed into controlled chaos as thousands of people, mobilized, and humans and elves worked side by side checking weapons systems and loading supplies and running final diagnostics, and there was no panic and no hesitation, and just grim determination. Lyra found Jake in his ready room 2 hours later, and he was studying tactical reports and trying to formulate a strategy against an enemy force twice the size of anything they had faced. She said quietly that this was what the Void Collective did, and when they found a worthy opponent, they committed overwhelming force and they sought to crush resistance before it could spread. And this assault on Earth was not just military strategy, but a message. Jake asked what message Lyra said. It was a message that hope was futile, and that alliance meant nothing against superior numbers, and that humanity should have stayed isolated and accepted their fate. Jake's jaw tightened, and he said then they would send a message back. The journey to Earth took 36 hours at maximum speed, and the Coalition fleet numbered 68 ships, and it was not enough, but it was what they had. And as they dropped out of hyperspace near Earth's moon, the scope of the battle became horrifyingly clear. The Void Collective had deployed their forces in 5 separate attack groups, and each one targeted a different core world, and Earth itself was under siege by 47 enemy vessels. And the human defense fleet was fighting desperately, but they were being pushed back, and orbital stations burned and debris filled near Earth space. Admiral Hayes transmitted coordinates and asked the Coalition to hit the enemy's center formation, and it was anchored by 2 Nexus vessels, and if they could destroy both, the entire attack force would lose coordination. Lyra studied the tactical display and noted that the Void Collective had learned from Tarsus, and the Nexus vessels were now heavily protected and surrounded by layers of defensive ships, and reaching them would require fighting through a gauntlet of fire. Captain Brooks suggested they use the subspace jump tactic again, but Lyra shook her head and explained the enemy would be watching for that, and they had deployed subspace inhibitors, and any attempt to use spatial distortions would result in catastrophic ship failures. Jake asked what she recommended. Lyra's expression became fierce, and she said they would do what her people should have done centuries ago, and they would fight together and trust each other and use every advantage they possessed. She outlined a strategy that was both elegant and audacious, and the Coalition fleet would split into 3 groups, and the first group, led by human carriers, would launch fighter wings to overwhelm the enemy's point defenses, and the second group of mixed cruisers would punch through the weakened formations, and the third group would be the Dragons. All 12 Dragons, now in the Coalition, would attack the Nexus vessels simultaneously, and their unique abilities to disrupt Void Collective technology made them the perfect weapon, and Starfire would lead them, and Lyra would coordinate the entire assault from his back. Jake protested that it was too dangerous, and she would be exposed and vulnerable. Lyra met his eyes and said this was what she was meant to do, and this was why she had spent 300 years fighting and learning and surviving, and not so she could hide when everything mattered most. She placed her hand on his shoulder and said, humans had taught her that hope was not passive, and it was active and fierce, and sometimes it required sacrifice, and if she fell today, she would fall. Knowing that the alliance would continue and that others would carry the light forward, Jake wanted to argue, but he saw the determination in her golden eyes and knew that nothing would change her mind, and so instead he clasped her hand and said, then they would make sure she did not fall alone. The battle began with a thunderous roar as Coalition fighters launched from their carriers, and thousands of small craft swarmed toward the Void Collective lines, and they moved in coordinated patterns that mixed human unpredictability with elven precision, and the enemy's targeting systems struggled to track so many small, fast-moving targets behind the fighter screen. The cruiser group accelerated, and their weapons blazed, and human railguns fired alongside elven energy lances, and the combined firepower carved holes in the enemy formation. Then came the Dragons. 12 magnificent creatures burst through the chaos, and their scales gleaming and wings spread impossibly wide, and they moved through space like they were born to it, and Starfire led them, and Lyra stood in her saddle, and her armor glowed with power. The Dragons split into 2 groups of 6, and each group targeted 1 Nexus vessel, and they wove through defensive fire with impossible grace, and smaller Void Collective ships tried to intercept, but the Dragons were too fast and too maneuverable. Lyra's voice carried across all Coalition frequencies, and she called out targeting coordinates, and